Hi, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Education in a Public Health Emergency, Navigating Special Education During School Closures and Stay-Home Orders for COVID-19. I'm Caitlin McAndrews, and joining me today is Michael Connolly from McAndrews, Mehalick, Connolly, Hulse and Ryan. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Connolly. I'm the supervising partner for the Special Education Law Department at McAndrews, and I have been involved in special education law for over 20 years now, and involved in representing parents in a variety of different issues.
And as I said, I'm Caitlin McAndrews. I am a former teacher and have been working in special education law now for about 8 years, and also work in our trust and estates department, primarily helping individuals with longer term planning for kids with special needs. But today we're specifically addressing special education issues during school closures for the global health emergency that we find ourselves in, and talking about guidance from the U.S. Department of Education and then state issues that we've seen playing out and recommendations for parents in addressing concerns with their school districts. To begin, we wanted to turn to the specific guidance that the Federal Department of Education has put out with regard to school districts addressing distance learning considerations and moving to educating students while schools are closed. There was initially guidance put out by the U.S. Department of Ed on March 12th, 2020, in a question and answer form, which during this time, we are recording this in mid-April, so a little over a month ago, and yet it has already changed so much because there's such rapid change. So the March 12 Q&A document is really from a time when, I think we thought that school closures were going to be shorter and not universal. And so that guidance, one of the big takeaways from it was that if schools were not providing education to their general education population, then they did not owe any education to their students with disabilities, and really made the situation more analogous to a snow day or a more brief school closure. The focus of that document was really more on the needs of students who were home when others were not. So it talked about services for students who were medically fragile and what to do if there was an outbreak in a particular school, as opposed to the mass school closures that we're seeing now. What I feel was an unintended consequence of that guidance was that a lot of schools, I think, delayed in beginning distance learning because they felt that the U.S. Department of Ed was saying, all right, if you don't provide services to regular ed students, then you're not going to run afoul of the special education laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act by not providing services to students with special education. Mike, would you agree?
I agree. I think although initially there was that 2-week closure, I think the real concern was seeing districts go in that route as a result of that initial guidance from the department, knowing that there was at least a decent chance at that time that these school closures would get extended and the impact that would have. And had they opened in 2 weeks, I don't think we'd have the issues that we ultimately did. But I think then once the school closures got extended, you had school districts kind of taking that same, and at least initially, a lot of school districts taking that same approach where they were going to not provide any services. And I think they were basing that a lot on their fear that by providing services to regular education students, they would then have to provide FAPE to special education students, and were concerned about their ability to do that within the confines of remote learning, and use that as really as the basis for not providing services at all. And I think that's the problem, that the unintended consequences of that initial guidance. So I agree.
And so soon after that guidance, we saw further guidance released by the U.S. Department of Education on March 17 and March 21st. And the Department of Ed made an unequivocal statement in the March 21st guidance saying that many school districts were not moving to virtual learning because of what it says is that they were reluctant to provide any distance instruction because they believe that federal disability law presents insurmountable barriers to remote education. This is simply not true. And that March 21st guidance really pushed the ball forward in encouraging districts to begin remote learning as quickly as possible, to begin it for all students, including students with disabilities, and that there were all sorts of services that could and really needed to be provided to students with disabilities during these stay-home orders. Did you want to talk any more about that March 21st?
Yeah, I do think that guidance did have an impact, and a lot of districts after receiving the March 21st guidance did make a shift. I think we still had some issues at that time because really of the state guidance that was out there, and talking about continuity of education plans and really defining it as two different options for continuity of education, at least in the Pennsylvania guidance did. One being providing planned instruction, which would be much more similar to what you would expect in school, but obviously on an online platform like Zoom or a similar platform, versus review and practice, which was giving kind of more lack of a better word, old school packets that students might get with worksheets or different types of information and activity for them to review and do some enrichment type work on skills and concepts that they may have already learned in their curriculum, but not really going into any sort of new instruction. And I think initially anyway, a lot of school districts were leaning towards that option, which is obviously a lot easier, I think, of an option to comply with than rolling out an online remote planned instruction where they've got to set all this up and they don't already have that platform and that structure in place.
Absolutely. And I think what I've seen is some of the districts that are more ahead of the ball on this started with those kinds of packets and review learning or review of already delivered instruction in an attempt to continue flexing those academic muscles, but moved as quickly as they could to more of a virtual platform and delivering virtual instruction. Is that what you've seen as well?
Yes, I agree. I think that it has happened. And I think in Pennsylvania, the guidance from the Pennsylvania Department of Education has also changed over time. And it has become more recently more clear that the Pennsylvania Department of Education's push is for planned instruction at this point. That Pennsylvania has now closed schools through the end of the year, and the guidance has really been for planned instruction, and the push is for planned instruction. I don't know that all districts in the state have jumped on that bandwagon yet, but I read the guidance to be much more mandatory than permissive from the Department of Education in Pennsylvania. And I think we're going to see more and more districts continue to move to that planned instruction model to get us through the end of this year, and potentially any summer programming, because it's still not clear to what extent schools are going to be open over the summer for extended school year, for example.
And perhaps I should have mentioned this at the start, but Mike primarily practices in Pennsylvania and I primarily practice education law in Delaware. So we are going to be focusing on those two states and the guidance that's been issued by their departments of education, as well as what we're seeing in school districts there. However, the federal law and federal DOE guidance applies across the board. So if you're viewing this from another state, there are a lot of suggestions for working with your school district and strategies that will be applicable to you as well. Before we move off of the federal guidance, which at this point, as I was saying, is pretty old, I did want to just touch on a couple of the services that the US DOE stressed are available to districts and should be considered during these times, which are distance instruction, teletherapy, teleintervention, meetings held on digital platforms, online options for data tracking, and for documentation, so online maintenance of records. as well as any low-tech strategies that we previously discussed, such as curriculum-based resources. I think it's especially important to keep in mind those higher tech strategies that the US DOE suggested, because we have seen, unfortunately, a lot of meetings canceled and a lot of therapies canceled that should at least be considered to be delivered over a virtual platform. It may not be as effective as in person. However, given the length of the shutdowns, we are seeing more districts move in that direction, and we hope to see even more follow suit.
Yeah. Another important thing to keep in mind, I think, on the federal regulations is that they have not waived any of the requirements of either IDEA or Section 504 at this time. That includes timelines, as well as the substantive and procedural provisions of those laws. Now, the stimulus package that came out does allow for and ask the Secretary, the United States Secretary of Education, to make recommendations within 30 days of any waivers that she believes should be made to the IDA or Section 504, and those need to be presented, I believe, to the House Committee on Education for further discussion and ultimately, I guess, recommendation to the full body. So as it stands right now, there are no waivers in place. So all of those laws are still applicable, obviously within some construct of the fact that we're now in remote learning and we don't have that face-to-face opportunity. So within the confines of the pandemic, those laws still apply.
And I think that also raises the important point from the guidance that school districts were advised they need to consider if compensatory services are necessary when students do return to school, because the entitlement to a free, appropriate public education has not been lifted at this point. Students are still entitled to a FAPE, as it's called, and therefore some students who are not able to receive the full benefit from their education when in a remote situation are going to need some compensatory services. We have not received a lot of guidance as to what that will look like, but the guidance is clear that districts need to consider that when students do return to the school buildings.
Yes.
So to speak a little bit more specifically about state guidance, I know that Pennsylvania has put out guidance to the Pennsylvania Department of Education has put out guidance. And then also there was a joint statement by the hearing officers from Pennsylvania's Office for Dispute Resolution. How has the pandemic affected the hearing process and timelines, if at all?
In large part, it hasn't, other than we're obviously hearings have now moved to a virtual format. They use, I believe the Office for Dispute Resolution uses GoToMeeting, but they're doing online virtual hearings. The timelines for due process hearings are still in place. The requirements for resolution meetings are still in place. None of that has been waived in Pennsylvania. There seems to be some flexibility and willingness to grant extensions on the part of hearing officers in Pennsylvania to make this work. Hearings are a little bit more, can be a little bit more divided up, if you will, depending on circumstances. It is obviously it is much harder with students at home, both for parents and for school districts and witnesses, to maybe be able to devote an entire day to a due process hearing, particularly if only one parent is home and the other parent still has to go in to work, or it's a one parent only home. It's a little bit more difficult. So we are seeing hearing officers do shorter days, and maybe it's one or two witnesses that they're completing, and they're doing more sessions over the period of time and taking a smaller amount of witnesses. But other than that, it really is moving. There's some other technical issues that we and logistic issues that we need to get around, with making sure witnesses have exhibits and things like that that you don't have to deal with when you're all together. But they have been moving forward, and the system continues to work despite the pandemic.
And in Delaware, we have not gotten to that virtual hearing platform level yet. So, whereas Pennsylvania was already equipped with a lot of the technology to conduct parts or all of hearings virtually, we almost never have virtual hearings. I can think of, in my experience, only one hearing where we had one witness testify virtually, and that was via phone. So there was no video capability and no screen sharing, which means that it's going to be a slower process of trying to move things forward. However, no hearing timelines have been waived. The federal guidance did ask parents and school districts to work flexibly with each other. And so I anticipate that we'll see requests for continuances more readily granted, that we will see a lot more flexibility in scheduling, and possibly have to continue hearings until times when people can appear in person. But as of right now, we haven't had an opportunity to sort of test that out yet. And we haven't received any guidance from the department on how they would be conducting hearings and when the need arises. In terms of, State Department of Education guidance for school districts, we also don't have quite the same level of state guidance for Delaware school districts that the Pennsylvania Department of Education has put out. But there's, guidance that is being worked out by various stakeholders in the state to, help school districts navigate through this. The Delaware system tends to be a bit more decentralized. And so we are seeing a lot of differences among school districts, with some still doing almost exclusively packet-based learning, and then other districts, really moving hard towards virtual instruction and, making efforts to get virtual capabilities to students who do not have it right now, even ones who are in Wi-Fi dead zones where they can't get Wi-Fi to their houses. And so they need to travel to, district provided hotspots in order to access that Wi-Fi.
And we are seeing some of that in Pennsylvania as well, with the certain rural areas in Pennsylvania that where internet coverage is spotty, and districts doing a similar thing where they're trying to create hotspots in the areas that families can travel to access online instruction.
Mm-hmm. And so in those cases, the families just have to bring a laptop and access the hotspot from their car. Is that right?
Yes, that's typically what happens. And the student is working from the car on a laptop, and most school districts in Pennsylvania are also able to meet the needs of students, or are working towards meeting the needs of students that don't have access to computers or laptops to be able to access the internet, and are providing devices for them to do that. Or at
And
least working towards that.
I'm sorry.
Or at least working towards that.
And there was some federal funding to states to help enable access to computers for students that did not have them.
Yes, that is correct. And I believe both Pennsylvania and Delaware are getting some of that funding to assist.
And while I don't practice very frequently in education cases in Maryland or Virginia or DC, there has also been guidance from those departments of education. I handle other matters in those jurisdictions. And in particular, if you are in Maryland, I would encourage you to go to the Maryland State Department of Education's website, their technical assistance bulletin page. Each technical assistance bulletin is organized by year. So if you scroll down to the bulletins that were released in 2020, they address the COVID-19 recommendations that the MSCE has given to school districts. And there are some very helpful specific guidelines in there about providing distance learning, conducting distance meetings, and providing services, especially to low incidence populations. Before we move on from the guidance that's come from state agencies and federal agencies, was there anything else you wanted to add about Pennsylvania, or should we move on to talking about strategies for dealing with parents' particular school districts?
No, I think we can move on and start to talk a little bit more about some real more practical strategies to help when you're dealing with your school districts. I think one of the main things to think about is, and this is true in pandemic and outside of the pandemic is really to kind of think about picking your battles, right, particularly right now, as far as what kind of issues you want to push, and what kind of issues you really need to push. As we said, timelines have not been waived, so annual IEP meetings should occur, and they can occur virtually, using platforms like Zoom or GoToMeeting or any of those kind of platforms. I know some school districts in Pennsylvania are using Google Hangouts as an option for meetings, and you could go more low tech, old school, and do it over the phone too, if you don't have that kind of access, or you only have one computer, and it's a choice between you being on your IEP meeting or your child accessing their education. You can just pick up the phone and use the phone. And even if they're doing something like Zoom or GoToMeeting, most of those platforms also have an option where you can simply just call in and participate only auditorily through the phone. So that would be one example of how to kind of continue to move the special education process along.
And I, personally have been really cautioning families against postponing IEP meetings. I know that we all have our plates really full right now with kids home, either working from home or the financial stressors of not working, or if you're an essential worker, having kids home and not being home with them. My concern is this is one of those battles that I'm willing to pick, because when we return to school, there's going to be a backlog. And even if every IEP meeting is held within the correct timelines right now, which we know is not going to happen, there is that guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that districts need to be considering compensatory services. So a lot of students are going to be coming back with different present levels than when they left, and districts are going to need to consider how they want to meet those needs, and how, and that oftentimes is going to involve a team discussion. So I worry that by not holding meetings now, and by not trying to find ways to hold meetings now, there's going to be a huge backlog, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on our families and on our districts.
No, I agree. And I think you could run into that same problem with evaluations. And I think evaluations are a little bit more tricky than IEP meetings to move it forward. There are certainly aspects of evaluations or reevaluations that can happen without having face-to-face contact. So review of data can be done, review of records can be done, interviews with teachers, parents, students can be done, rating scales that can be completed can be done. There's some debate as to what extent assessments can be done virtually on this kind of video conference platform. So I think to what extent those kinds of things can happen will depend on the student, the evaluator, and kind of making a case-by-case determination as to whether or not it would be appropriate and valid to do those kinds of tests, or which ones might be valid, which ones might not. But even if to the extent that you can't complete those tests that need to be done, or obviously classroom observations, things like that can't occur, I think you can complete the rest of the evaluation, issue the evaluation based on that information with an indication that once schools resume, we're going to pick up and complete the components of the evaluation that we couldn't because of the pandemic. Because I think there are some school districts that are kind of taking the approach that we're just not going to do evaluations until we can do the whole evaluation. And I think you are going to run into the same problem with backlog once schools do open, because now you are going to have all these evaluations all at once where you've done no aspect of it, and you've got 60 days now to complete all of these evaluations under the regulations. And you've got limited number of school psychologists and tons of students, and the school districts aren't going to be able to get it done. It's going to be, impossible to manage. So I think from their own perspective, they are better off school districts are better off doing as much of the evaluation as they can remotely now, and then finishing up those portions that they can't when school resumes.
I agree. And in terms of the picking your battles, this is one of those areas where I say you don't have to come across as the bully or mean or overly demanding, but really approach it from the perspective of I'm concerned that this is going to create a backlog down the line. There are aspects of this that we can address now. I'm willing to be flexible. In terms of the turnaround, if you need to do a parent interview and you need to reschedule, I understand. I may need to, but we want to make sure that we're moving this along.
Absolutely, because again, not only are they going to have all the evaluations that that may have been delayed over these months, they're also going to have evaluations that are going to be due in the fall. So the potential for a very large backlog of evaluations is a real possibility if they don't move things along.
Are there specific things that are coming up that you're advising families to, if not let go of right now, be more flexible on?
I think some issues, particularly it depends on what, if there's certain aspects of the IEP that are particularly difficult to be implemented in this stage. Now, to me, now is not the time to take on more adversarial posture on what's going on during the COVID-19. I think your parents are better off to raise those points, but move forward as much as possible in a collaborative manner to get as much support and services as you can during this time. And then when schools reconvene, the team is going to need to look at the impact that not having everything in the IEP has caused, and how are we going to fix and make that up at that time. And I think that's the better approach than trying to, go to mediation, go to due process hearing over what is occurring right now in the context of the pandemic, as opposed to, more substantive long-term issues that may have existed pre-COVID-19. And not an issue with what am I getting in the context of my remote instruction.
Yeah, I say not to think of it as, take what you can get, because that sounds so negative, but to work with the district to get what you can and what you feel is appropriate under the circumstances, but that this isn't the time to rush to, as you said, mediation or a hearing, because even though the timelines haven't been lifted, the timelines are what they are, and I see a quick turnaround in normal times of a hearing being 2.5 to 3 months. Usually
Yes.
it's going to be longer during this time period. And so the likelihood that you're going to get what you're looking for quickly is pretty low. Also, it won't be viewed as well by a hearing officer if you're taking an overly adversarial approach. So again, it's not really take what you can get, but concentrate on what what you can collaboratively work out with the district right now. Noting any objections in a polite way, so that when schools reopen, you can look back and say, okay, this is an area where we're going to need to reassess how the student is doing. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, services that really require face-to-face, hands-on interaction being the chief among those areas that I think are going to need to be addressed.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. A hearing is not going to get resolved. There's a high likelihood that the students could potentially be back in school before that hearing is getting any sort of final resolution where you're seeing any benefit from it. So I absolutely agree. Another area that we see a lot, I think we see a lot of issues in, is as it relates to related service. And this is, again, an area where video conferencing, telephone communication can really help in doing teletherapy, essentially. Particularly, for some might be a little bit more difficult, or some aspects of some therapies, like physical therapy, for example. Certain aspects of that could be a little bit difficult to do or impossible to do in a remote setting. But certainly aspects of occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, counseling can be done in this teletherapy mode.
Absolutely. And I like to look to another related service during this time that is infrequently used in non-pandemic times, but I think could be especially useful now, which is parent training. Parent training is during healthy times, typically delivered either by having the parent come observe the therapist in school, or the therapist or teacher speaking with the parent about the interventions that are being used and are being successful in school, so that the parent can then support those same interventions in the home. And during this time when some therapies may not be available to students, whether they be physical therapy, occupational therapy, or even just some of the same extent of supportive instruction, it is a really useful time to be looking at parent training and how school personnel can, through either a telephone conference or a video conference like this, give the parents some pointers and some suggestions on supporting their student in the home environment and carrying over some of those skills that were abruptly discontinued in school.
I absolutely agree. I think parent training, this is probably the most critical time for parent training in its history of being a related service. And sometimes it's a term that I think uh, districts look at and see as something very overwhelming. They sometimes people will think of it as it's some sort of formal training of parents, or that's not what parent training has to be. I mean, you can certainly provide that kind of training to parents, but that's not the whole of parent training. It is, I think what you talked about, Katie, having therapists talk with the family about what they can be doing during therapy sessions, or as follow through, because it's no longer the teachers that are with the student the majority of the day, it's now the parents. The same thing with having that kind of communication with parent, between the parent and the teacher, about what kinds of supports should a parent be providing throughout the day for their child, and both from an academic standpoint as well as for kids that have social, emotional, and in particular behavioral difficulties throughout their day.
And one thing that I say to educators sometimes is a lot of things that good teachers do, they do without thinking about it. And so it's taken for granted that a parent may try to do the same, and they just don't even know to try it. So giving very fluid, natural, positive reinforcement for engagement in these Zoom class sessions, which can be really difficult for students, and providing more structure to a student's day, where age appropriate or developmentally appropriate, through a visual schedule. These are all the kinds of things that a lot of times good teachers are doing naturally, but that we as parents don't remember, don't think to do, and can make a big difference in delivery of instruction in the home.
Absolutely. Agree 100%.
Before we move on to talk about just a couple of strategies and tips for home-based learning, I've seen a fair amount of back and forth on whether or not to hold IEP meetings or to issue prior written notices for changes that are going to be delivered during COVID-19 school closures, changes to the students' instruction. Have you seen a lot of differences there?
We have in Pennsylvania. We've seen generally two approaches. I have not seen a lot of convening of IEP meetings for this purpose, but I have seen a mix of some districts issuing NORPs to families, explaining what some better than others, but explaining what's going to be occurring during the remote instruction, what that remote instruction is going to look like, and indicating that it is temporary during the pandemic, and that when schools reopen, the full IEP that is currently in place will go back into effect, and the program would resume as it otherwise would be, and that is the pendant placement, so that they're not changing pendency in any way. And then I've seen other districts try and accomplish that same thing in a letter, as opposed to a NORP. Personally, I don't know that I have a strong preference one way or the other. I think the big concern is making sure that it is clearly identified, however the notice is coming, that the services are temporary in nature and are not changing the dependent program otherwise. I think those are the important clarifications that need to come, whether in letter form or through an order.
Mhm. And I think it has to be specific to the student at some point. I understand a lot of districts are issuing that notice saying there are changes coming, but at some point I think parents need to be advised, okay, this is what your student will be receiving during school closures.
Agreed. Yeah, it should so that they know what that day is going to look like, what services they're going to get. Absolutely.
Was there anything else you wanted to discuss in terms of strategies for moving or for working directly with your school district?
No, I think really the best thing that parents can do is try and work. I think in the context of this environment, I think trying to work as collaboratively as you can with your district to get the services that your child needs in place and the supports that you may need as a parent to make sure they can get through the day and access the education that is able to be provided is the best approach for working with your districts during this period.
So to finish up, we did want to just touch on a couple of strategies for parents who are working through home-based learning with their students. And we already touched on one of them, which is to, as best you can, try to have a schedule with your child and communicate that to them in an age-appropriate manner. To the degree that school districts are advising you what services you'll be getting, that'll be easier. But some districts I've seen have put out kind of sample schedules of how you can structure your day, whether that's starting and ending the day with a little physical activity by getting out for a walk around the block or in the backyard, what time lunch generally will be, if there's a quieter time of the day after lunch. Again, it's going to really depend on the age of the student. But one of the great things about this time is that you can structure it based on your child's needs. So if you are that parent who's been asking for an alternate schedule of your high school students' IEP team for a long time, you could put in place that alternate schedule now. You just want to make sure that it's it's still something that they're adhering to. So if your high school student naturally does wake up at 9 a.m., making sure that there is an actual start to the day after 9 a.m. I really think that visual schedules are great for students of a variety of ages and needs, and putting together that visual schedule so that they have the the image to go with what their daily routine looks like. Even students who are readers, I think having the word associated with a visual, I think, can be really beneficial.
I absolutely agree. And we do have some, on our website, we do have some additional parent resources in our MLO minutes section of our website that gives some more ideas and strategies that you can work on during the day with your child.
And we'll post with this video a link to some of those resources, which also contain links to some helpful websites that you can look to for additional activities to do with your students, especially if your district is one of those that hasn't really rolled out enough distance learning for you to feel like your child is actively engaged. The other thing that I touched on before that I did just want to mention again is positive reinforcement. I think it's really easy to be very negative during this time, but to try and remember that, psychological research has told us that the best ratio of positive reinforcement to negative or to, corrective feedback is 3-to-1. So if you can be looking out for things that your students are doing well and reinforcing that, it does help to get some momentum going for them in terms of, advancing, because it is harder to get that positive reinforcement when they are not having as frequent contact with other people and with teachers, and they're not engaging in as much of a face-to-face manner. They may be really seeking that.
Absolutely.
If you're noticing any regressions, I would just try to document it because as I think we've all seen, the days tend to string together, and you want to be able to look back and say, okay, this is when I started to notice these issues. And obviously that's going to be student and age dependent, but it could run the range from, toileting issues all the way to, more higher level academic issues, but I would try to keep a log for yourself of any, struggles that you're seeing with your child. And for your own part, really try to reinforce them during times of high stress. It is more common to see regression in students. And so, whatever we can do to support our kids and helping them feel safer and supported, I think can help with some of those regression concerns.
Yeah, and share that information with your case manager, the IEP team, and see if they can give you any, as part of that parent training, any ideas or support on how to address that, and also that'll help them to know what they might be able to do during times of planned instruction to assist with any regression that you might be seeing.
And finally, I wanted to mention that anyone who may have compensatory education funds from, past issues with the school district, now could be a really good time to use some of those funds for virtual instruction. Again, we'll link to some providers with this video, but I know, for example, Linda Mood Bell has offered virtual instruction to students in more rural areas that don't have access to an education center for years. So it's been going on before this pandemic, and the platform is there. If your student is not getting a lot of distance instruction from the district, or even if you're just concerned that they're falling behind, this could be a really good use of some of those funds. Also, teletherapy for students who already have anxiety. If you want to increase their counseling, that this could be a good way of increasing their counseling during this time, to make sure, again, that they're feeling supported and that they're getting the mental health support that they need during what is, for a lot of us, a very stressful time.
Absolutely.
Before we adjourn, was there anything else, Mike, that you wanted to add in terms of tips or strategies?
I don't think so. I think, again, your idea of accessing the compensatory education funds, if you have any available, is an excellent idea. A lot of tutoring services are going online, even if they weren't prior to this pandemic. So the services are out there. And if you can access them, that's great. And some of the resources that will be linked to the video will have links to sites where there is some of that online support that you can get, and some of it at low cost for those who don't, or no cost for those who do not have compensatory funds available to them.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today and for listening in. And thank you, Mike, for putting this information out there. We really appreciate all of you, and we hope that you all stay well and stay safe, and that we will see you all in person soon.
Thank you, Katie, and everyone stay safe.